Special thanks to WaterStone for sponsoring Socrates in the Studio Season 3.
So at what point do you turn explicitly toward atheism? In other words, when you see this example, let's say, of faith lived out in a devoted way, it's repulsive. At what point are you embraced by what we call the new atheism?
So it's not so much embraced. I rejected Islam, and because I was steeped in Islamist literature, first during my years as a Muslim Brotherhood sympathizer, but also in the years when I'm fighting with the Dutch elite and then later on the European elites, and I'm telling this is what the Islamists are saying, what comes up over and over again is we love death and you love life. And so it is, as a Muslim, it's a sin to love life more than you love death. Loving death means you're looking forward to going to go to the hereafter, meeting God and living in eternal bliss. And so you have to love death. And I became an atheist because atheism, as I interpreted it at the time, was a love of life, a life on this earth, that there was no life after death. And it was perfect. I wasn't afraid anymore of being punished in the grave or beyond. I wasn't afraid of the social control that, if you're a Muslim, so in the first 10 years in Holland, the way I survived being a Muslim but leading the life of a Dutch woman was simply by avoiding all contact with Muslims so that they didn't have any social control over me. And becoming an atheist liberated me from all of that. And now that I had liberated myself from the God of Islam, I wasn't in the least about to entertain entering another religion. And so unfortunately, I not only condemned Islam, but I also started taking part in condemnations of Christianity, which my understanding of Christianity was so poor. The Christians I saw were very peaceful and very pleasant. And I remember saying terrible things about Christianity and having Christians retort by saying, we'll pray for you. And I remember citing this even to Christopher Hitchens and Sam Harris and telling them, well, these ones want to slit my throat and these ones want to pray for me. Surely is some difference between the religions. And in our circles, we would acknowledge these differences, but for some reason, atheism is, many atheists are just anti-religion in general. That is their faith. And so the criticism of religion continued, and I shut myself off from ever considering, getting a spiritual life or going back into. I thought the word spirituality to me it was a bit like homeopathy. It's like fake and it's just a feel good nonsense. Yeah,
But it's interesting that you referred to atheism as a kind of religion, but it has to be because everybody wants to know what is the ground of your belief. If you believe in tolerance or what we would call religious liberty, that we should let people with whom we disagree live their lives, the obvious question is, well, where do you get that idea from? And the new atheists can be belligerent in not answering that question. But you were content with that for quite a while.
Absolutely. And I think also my observation is you have Christian atheists or Judeo-Christian atheists. Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins are steeped in Christian morality. Okay, they are in the way they live pretty much Christian, and they adhere to Christian norms, but they rejected the fundamentals of the faith. Jesus' miraculous birth, the stories in the Old Testament, they condemn those things. And so, unfortunately for them, they they're left with no curiosity about the history of Western thought. And I was attracted, as a Muslim atheist, I was attracted to the history of Western thought. Where did all of this come from? And how did it come about? And what makes them into sort of a faith group is they're able to easily reject Christianity and Judaism and all of these things without, and they think they know it all. They think there's nothing these religions can teach them. Whereas empirically speaking, if I am told, Genesis 1-7, inspired that we are created in God's image, and then the institutions and laws that were placed on that sparks my curiosity. I want to know, is it true? And how did it happen? And unfortunately, the new atheists, they shut off that sort of inquiry. In other words, they threw the baby out with the bathwater.
Yeah. There's a fascinating parallel in that you were very devoted to a dogmatic way of thinking that was Islam. And you, for whatever reason, I don't know whether it's innate, but you thought for yourself and you thought your way through that. You said, ultimately, I have to reject this. This is constricting, suffocating. But then, of course, you find yourself within another dogmatic system, which is now, we can call it New Atheism, which similarly forbids or frowns on asking the questions that you couldn't help but ask. But you persisted in asking those questions.
I did. And it wasn't just the cerebral process and intellectual growth of asking questions, it was also human experience. I mean, I actually experienced a need for spirituality, which I didn't understand. I just didn't understand why I was so depressed and unhappy and living in this mental anguish until a therapist told me, I don't think your problem is material or physical. I think you are spiritually bankrupt and you will have to consider doing something about that. And it's then that door opened, and because that statement resonated with me where I was at the time in 2022. And so 2023.
Very recently, yeah.
And so it wasn't just, I was asking questions, but also it was real life experience. Humans can't live by bread alone.
It's interesting because your friend Richard Dawkins is extraordinarily hidebound, I would say, on the issue of materialism. And so even saying that I have a spiritual dimension, or I feel something, a longing for something beyond the material, seems to be anathema to Richard Dawkins and to others who are strict materialists and who seem to be really dogmatic in that way of thinking. To my mind, almost preposterously so. I'm fascinated by that kind of dogmatism on their part.
And I think that is where you get to see that atheism or humanism is just another faith, and that people believe in it with considerable strength. And yes, it can take on a dogmatic appearance. And one thing that I thought also was not great was people within the new atheist group just having this enormous amount of contempt for people of faith. And so they couldn't get, part of the curiosity was dulled because they couldn't get over their contempt for for religion, and that's unfortunate. I'm not the only one, I think, but if you're not a Christian atheist or a Jewish atheist, say you come like me, a Muslim atheist, because Islam was the first religion that I grew up in and that I understood and rebelled against. And so when I became an atheist, I was drawn to reason, to the Enlightenment, to all sorts of features of Western civilization, and I was driven by where does all this come from? And what I find is atheists from India, atheists from other parts of Islam, once they get into this level, many of them end up becoming Christian. And so atheism for people of these different civilizations is a phase, not necessarily the end point.